In all of our experiences today as a community, what's special to me is knowing how closely we're related, that we've all derived from the same ancestors, and I've always been told which ancestors they were. They were Tla'ax'la'amai, Chatsinawit, Cheney, and Akista. How important it is to know your relations within your community as well as the neighboring tribes, how you relate to the land. Even myself growing up, harvesting berries, fishing, having uncles and cousins that hunt. Like, that's what makes you who you are. That's what makes you Sechelt.
Joe Lidelli was my great-great-grandfather. And Joe Lidelli came from Vancouver Bay. And he lived there alone until he married his wife. And she came from Thormanby Island. So when he was courting her, he had to canoe his way all the way from Vancouver Bay to Thormanby Island. Yeah, but here's one of Joe Lidelli's sons, who's my great-grandfather, and his name is Basil Joe. Basil's the first one to attend residential school. They were the first students, my great-grandfather. When he went to school, Basil, he didn't know how to read or write and speak English. He didn't speak English. Even when I was growing up, he didn't speak much English. They wanted him to sign his name, so they put an X, and they said, instead of Lidelli, they said, we're just going to call you your last name Joe, because it's simpler for you. So they took our name Lidelli, Joe Lidelli, and then took Joe Lidelli's first name Joe, and then that's how we became Joes. We really are Lidellis, yeah. Basil died when I was 13, and when I was about 11, he took me outside in the front of his house, and he had huge hands, and he said, see that rock over here, and that rock over there? I said, yeah. He said, that's our land, don't you ever forget it.
We're the Mayooks. My ring size is 15. My grandfather, Basil, was 23. And I remember sitting on his lap as a kid and playing with his aluminum ring. It was aluminum, and it was probably, I would say, that big. And I was amazed. I used to put my fingers through it, right? And I don't know whatever happened to that aluminum ring, but we're the Mayooks. We always had big hands. My dad had big, huge hands, right? My dad's name was Mayook, and I got passed that name down to me, right? Which I'm very proud to hold today. I'm the only one in the nation with that name. We used to go up to Huntington. We used to go logging up there. My grandfather would get a logging permit, and he would have his sons, William, Junior, Gilbert, and all of them fall in and log in, and we'd stay in the camp, right? It was so great. You know, we're living off the land, we're staying in these camps, mom and them cooking. To us, it was a holiday. Very good days, you know, I loved them. You know, I'll never forget those days. Like they say, when you're poor in those days, you're closer to your family than you are, right? I'll never forget those days. We're all happy.
We were living in a bounty full of wealth where we didn't have to go to the store and pay for it, you know? We didn't have to go pay for oysters. We got it free. We got our clams free from Bear Bay. The things that we had to do with the clams was shucking them out of the shell and sticking them on a stick, like 8 of them on one stick. And they'd hang them in the sun to dry. And this is another food that we put away for the winter. You take it off the stick in the winter and you chew on it like gum. It was dry, it was chewy. So that was another staple that we always preserved. It was clams on a stick. We had berries. Granny did preserves. We did the clams on a stick. We dried oysters too. Granny dried a lot of flowers. And she put these tasty flowers in with our suppers. She said, "Eat it, it's good." And those were the thimbleberry.
You know, I hated plucking ducks. That's the thing I hated when I was a kid, right? My dad was the hunter of the family. He was such a great shot. He was like a sniper, and he would go out and shoot 5 deers and a white goat. And my great-grandfather, Basil, the delicacy to him was the goat's stomach.
During the 1930s, our people were still not really immersed in Western commodities or staples. So during the Depression, when things became really scarce, like coffee, flour, sugar, our elders said that the fellow non-Indigenous community members, it was a real sacrifice for them not to have those foods. So they used to give their rations to the non-Sechelt people because they actually thought they needed them more because they were suffering more without them.
Grandpa would always say, "Only take what you need." And that's what we went by, is taking only what we needed.
Growing up in that environment, it was fantastic. You know, we all had our jobs to do in those days, and we're all poor, but we're the happiest.
That was my life. And then, I was a happy little girl when I lived up there. And, like when we had that place up there, everybody was happy. When we came to Sechelt, our happiness ended. And that was due to residential school.
As you know, we all 4 generations went to that residential school.
There was my great-grandfather, Basil, went to residential school. Then my grandmother and grandfather went to residential school. My mom and dad, and then me, 4 generations of residential school. So you can imagine how dysfunctional that became for us. Very dysfunctional.
Hey, there's the residential school.
Where was it? Purple?
This was near the road where Uncle Howie's house is now.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the front was.
Are you serious?
Yeah. Isn't that something?
Was it bad in there?
It was bad. It's a sad history, but it made us stronger, right? It did. It made us, all of the Sechelt Nation, strong people, right? We're all fighters, right? Warriors, right? So that warrior blood always came out and helped us to survive, right?
It was funny, I went to church in the 80s, and my husband said to me, "Why do you go to church? I don't understand you. Didn't they do horrible things to you?" And I said, "Well, yeah, they did, but I was still brainwashed. I had children already. I had all my children, 4 of them, but I was still going to church. And then I realized when he said that, I said, yeah, this is not my religion. And the first time I seen a masked dancer, the SYIYAYA-Our, as soon as they started singing and dancing, I burst out crying, just lost it, because that was who I was. That was who I was. And it was amazing. It was beautiful. Everything was so amazing. And I identified with it immediately. I had never seen it before. I had nothing to identify myself with. And so when I identified with the SYIYAYA-Our dancers, I knew I had to learn more.
We lived in Hanichin. Papa and Grandma and other relatives, other people that lived there in Hanichin. It was a small band, and same with Sonai. As you know, years ago, at that time, before my time, smallpox killed off a lot of people there. I heard 7,000, then other people saying, no, it wasn't that many. Well, I don't know, that's what I heard on the stories. And they had fast runners and strong paddlers to go up north talking about the smallpox, to stay away from Vancouver is where they got it from.
Sechelt was a home for the winter, and then during the summers they would all go back up into the inlets to gather whatever their specialties would be.
When Europeans first came, it started in the east and moved west here to the British Columbia. When they arrived, they described it as like a resource mecca. There was just, you could walk on the water. There was so much fish. And the way I look at it is our people lived in harmony with the environment and knew how to take care and sustain their resources. You have hunting and gathering societies, although we also practiced extensive aquaculture and forms of agriculture through transplanting and pruning and keeping our berry bushes really healthy and sustainable. They say the Squamish people pre-contact might have numbered 30,000 people, and the Sechelt people potentially over 20,000 people.
There were many thousands of natives in this area, many powerful chiefs who lived in this area, and they dictated what was happening in this region. So they dictated how life was conducted. Marriages were arranged, potlatches were held for many months. Dances, songs, names, all originated from this area.
What I've been taught about what life was like was how we were very interdependent in our living, and whatever you harvested, hunted, it was always shared. And the highest quality you could have would be generosity. And people never focused on the accumulation of wealth. It was always redistributed. It's all the strengths and skills we have that make us a tribe. One of the things I enjoy growing up in a community that is based in an oral tradition was you grew up with older people in your community that your parents and your grandparents know more closely because they grew up together. And my mom would share with me, you know, what I thought was magic. She would share with me like people's talents, or if they were able to commune with nature, or maybe even commune with the spirits. And I think that's a pretty special way to grow up.
I grew up in a natural environment of being in the wild with not only the killer whales, sea lions, and in them days they were like giants, right? We used to swim with the sea lions, we used to swim with the killer whales, and there was no fear. There was just like a brotherhood.
I spent a lot of time with my grandfather, Captain Joe Dixon, and my grandmother, whom I call Mama, and my grandfather is Papa. And he had a little hand line made up for me. At that time, there was a lot of fish. There was so much salmon in the inlets, you practically walk across it. There was that many salmon. And when he told me to, in our language, to put the line out, be only about 5-10 feet on the stern of the dugout canoe, I already have one on. That's how much salmon was in the inlets a long time ago. Today, you could troll for a week, maybe get one salmon.
Our people depended on the salmon. You know, we're up and down this coast, we're all the salmon people. Fishing goes back a long ways in our culture. The salmon we used to catch, spring salmon, 100-pound spring salmons. You know, the smaller ones were 50 pounds. And I remember my dad teaching me the areas when I was, 11, 12 years old. When I was probably, I would say probably 8 years old until I was 13, I fished with my father on his little boat. It was called the Miss Richmond too. And we used to go up to Rivers Inlet every summer. My grandfather, Clarence Joe, we'd go up out jigging and he would tell me, he says, this area here, you'll get these little red snappers. He said, this is the only area you can get them, right? And this is a family secret, he says, right? And I still know where that area is. In those days, there were so many canneries on the coast. The fishing was abundant.
I tell you, up at Jarvis Inlet, my home lands up there, is the salmon up there. As a child, I could not believe how big they were. So it was nothing for men or women to go out and catch a big salmon on a rod. So we'd go up the beach and cook it, open fire. 3 hours of cooking. And while it's cooking, you could see the fat dripping on the bottom. And you go, God, can't wait to tie into that. Because it's always so good, fresh salmon out of the water, and you do an open fire on the beach, and you're forever wiping your lips, you know. I taught a guy that wrote a book of recipes. It was a good 1.5-inch thick book, and all recipes from different people. And then, of course, he was putting mine in there, and he says, I would like to learn how to do that, Jamie. I said, as Ma was sharing anyways, and he said, oh, that's great. You don't mind if I take any pictures? And I said, no, you can't. Why? He's looking, why can't I take your picture? Is it because they're going to take your spirit away? No, you haven't got the lens off, I told him.
There was a lot of people, the first non-natives that moved to our inlet, you know, they'd always come to our encampment and ask for food. And like my grandfather was a giving person. He never asked for a thank you or a payment or anything. He just helped them. And then that's how they started learning, was coming to us and learning how they had to survive in the bush. And that's, I was telling everybody, I'm like, well, nobody knows the real story, right? You know, like, we have to start telling these real stories.
My father used to get cut off from hunting. The government would cut us off, and deliberately, and starve us that way. In those days, you know, there was no welfare or anything, right? We lived off the land, right? And the government's telling us we couldn't do it. I remember my mom struggling to feed the family. There was 9 of us in the family, and she would say, there's only so much food here. Sister Rena, she ate her food fast because she was hungry, and she came over and she was standing and she was looking at my food, right? And I just pushed it over to her. I said, you can have it. And my mom would come over, she says, you know, you're probably not going to eat for 2 or 3 days, you know? And I said, that's fine. And I said, I can get food myself. I said, you know, in those days, I used to do a lot of stealing just to survive, you know, going into the grocery stores and taking whatever I needed. Of course, I got caught some of the times, but it was either that or starved to death.
We had basically, the oldest children of each family had to stand back from a table and let the small ones eat. And we didn't mind, you know, because we can go forage. But that they had such a hold over all the First Nations peoples. Forestry was the people who worked for hunting and wildlife. They were worse than the police watching our band members.
Sometimes we went to school hungry. I just remember getting a lot of stomach aches when I was a little girl. My son said, what was in your fridge when you were a little girl, Mom? I said, we didn't have a fridge.
In order to create a balance between life and spirit, there was a religion in our culture called winter spirit dancing. That would allow the Spirit to come into the reality of life. So the Spirit would come into life and be able to perform, to sing, to dance, to express their religion. It's an expression of my ancestors, my forefathers.
We were happy to get ready to go to school. We were all happy. We didn't know what we were walking into.
The first thing I learned when I went to school was I was a sinner. Did you ever hear the word sinner?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was a sinner, and I was like 5 years old, so I didn't know what a sin meant. It was like a scary word for me. And so I was told I was a sinner right off the bat. I'm sure the nuns were not real teachers. We did a little bit of math. They called it arithmetic. And this is what one teacher said to me. We had to learn how to spell arithmetic. And when you're young, arithmetic is a hard word to spell. And this is how she told me how I should remember how to spell arithmetic. She said, a rude Indian thought he might eat tobacco in church. That's how she made me learn the spelling of arithmetic. And I never forget that, never forgot it. It's stuck in here. And I'm 67 years old now, and it's still there. The Roman Catholic Church was the one that was implementing our schooling. It was based around mostly religion. Religion, heaven, hell, purgatory, limbo. I learned all those words that year. It was pretty scary when you thought you were going to go to hell.
All day, every day, prayers, prayers, prayers. When you get up in the morning, by our bed, we have to have a prayer. Before you wash up, you had a prayer. Before you go back to the dormitory, you had to have a prayer. You had to make up your bed before you leave the dormitory, you had to pray. Before we go into the dining room, you had to have a prayer. And before we sit down, we have a prayer before we eat. When we finish eating, we have to have a prayer. Hail, Hail Mary, hail this, hail that, hell that, hell this, I said.
When we came to the residential school, all I learned was hunger, because you could smell the food in the residential school cooking, and it would make you hungry, right? Because you'd smell it all day.
There was like constant stories about how the priests, the brothers, and the nuns ate like kings and queens with fresh cream and cheese. All of the food that was the labors of the children. They were labor camps, but the children never got to have the same type of food.
My dad slipped once when he was talking about residential school. He said if I was up at 4 o'clock every morning picking eggs and milking the cows, why was I starving? So they were starving up there. And he says, we had dry mush, and sometimes our toast would have mold on it, and they would still feed it to us. And then he stopped because he felt the emotion coming on, and he never ever said another word again. Didn't want to talk about it.
You couldn't talk to your friend or your brother or your sister or your cousins. We're not allowed to. We weren't allowed to speak one native word or were punished. We were not even allowed to speak to any of our parents or grandparents walking by the residential school. We were not allowed to wave at them. We'd get the strap.
Actually, the only time you could see your parents or relatives was Christmas break, Easter, and summer. In between those time periods is when you were, just strictly in the residential school, and that was it. Been in the residential school for 10 years, so, I lost a lot of pretty much my childhood. I actually learned to speak Latin more fluently than I did our language because of the Catholic religion.
All our songs were done in Latin, so I could sing in Latin when I was a little girl. Isn't it unreal? Singing in Latin, speaking some French. Never knew my own language. And when I heard my own language being spoken by Granny, my grandfather and grandmother, I thought it was an odd language.
You do what you're told, everything, yeah. And whoever was out of line, they got their ears pulled from behind with one of the oblates or the nuns. Even the priests used a ruler, a yardstick, to give you lashes. When I was in grade 7, I took a strap away from a priest. There, grabbed it, pulled it out of his hand, and I started whipping him with it. How do you like that? Is that fun? Do you like that? He says, please don't tell them. That's not right, I said. You're doing everything wrong.
One of the nuns said to me, "Who loves you?" And we all sat there, and she said, "Well, God loves you." And then the next time that question was brought up, "Who loves you?" And I put my hand up right away. I was like, I know, God loves me. And she said, "Why would God love you? You're nothing less than a dog to God." That's the day I lost my voice. I didn't speak anymore in classroom. The more you go into your own language and culture, the more you heal. Because there's words in our language, you can't describe them in English. It's not describable. It's you don't know how to say it in English, and that's what I learned. And I also learned that this animal, like this dog, the word was different, so it was chino. So what does chino mean? It means an animal with fur that's got a long tail. It's a description of what the animal looks like, and their descriptions were very precise in our language. I didn't know my language, so then the belief system for me was, I better learn my language because when I cross over, I want to be able to speak to them in our language. And that's what drove me to know it more and more.
I know a little bit of the language, but I'm more into my culture of carving. A lot of years have gone by before I really got into it, learning more about my culture as a Sechelt Nation member. The hummingbirds, as told by my late father-in-law, says it represents healing. So what an opportunity that was to use those designs of the hummingbirds on that pole for the hospital, the healing pole.
Discipline about life is about mind, body, and spirit. I think we got to come back to that. So that mind, body, and spirit is you got to be creating a balance about how you conduct your life, not just by the way you walk every day, but the very things that you eat, or the way you consume, the way that you breathe, the way that your spirit carries you, is a whole discipline about life and creating that balance about life. Otherwise, if you're out of balance, then you're going to be miserable, right?
What's life all about? And what's happiness? Living off the land and working together.
What I fight for is for the children. where like I wish I had somebody to speak up for me when I was young, who could have told me all these different things that I tell all these other children in school. And I tell them their history of their family. And I'm like, your grandmother was such a beautiful person. And I still forage. I still go get cedar, and I do my cedar work. I do my weaving. I do medicine. I'm really passionate about medicine. And we go and pick our own teas. And it's like doing a complete circle from when you were a child to now. And I'm like, hey, I done that. You know, you get that when you've done it, it's done. So what do I do now? So I figured the best thing I could do is just share my stories.
One of the things that I'm really proud of as a Sechelt person is the strength and power of our people, because we worked as a collective. And I know the Sechelt people were known throughout the coast as orators and great storytellers. I've always been really proud of the fact that we have this really rich culture, and we really utilize those skills to the fullest to help our people.